It's 11. Welcome to this Introduced by Technically workshop session. Assess your organization's cultural competencies, strengths, and weaknesses. I'm Sabrina Verboulias, the editor of Generosity. I'm here to introduce our workshop leaders, JL Chambers and Elisa Vasquez of Cultured Enough. I'm going to drop a link in the chat, which is a piece that appeared about them at Technically, and want to remind you to use the chat to ask JL and Elisa questions during the presentation. So thank you for being here, JL and Elisa, and take it away.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having us. We're looking forward to this time. Just know something before we even get started. We're big into our process of how we address and talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, that we have questions. So at any point, we don't even have to wait until we're done with a few of our points. You have a question, we'll stop, address it, just because we know it's rarely questions around diversity inclusion in a space where you maybe have an expert or expertise willing to talk about it. And so once again, my name is Joe Chambers. I'm the founder of Cultured Enough, which Cultured Enough is a diversity consulting firm. We exist to help small and medium-sized businesses who can't afford a chief diversity officer do that at an affordable price. And so we've been doing this for around 5 years. We have 11 individuals on our team. And I get the honor and the privilege actually of getting to talk, hang out with, and work along and partner with Elisa. You want to sort of give your introduction? The mic is yours.
Of course. My name is Elisa Vasquez. I'm based in Philly as well, as I assume most of you are. And my background is mainly in HR and nonprofit management assessment. Also really helping partners looking at and then assessing their processes and their policies around diversity and inclusion. So like JL said, I love what I get to do just in terms of being down to earth and really helping CEOs who may have never kind of navigated this space of diversity and inclusion before, and really meeting them where they are to be able to empower them to move their organization along. So I've been in coaching for about 2 years now, and I'm looking forward to getting right to it. What about you, JL?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. One of the things you'll know about our approach is that we truly just believe as an organization, success should be simple, fun, and relational, as in there should be an opportunity where you know where you're going and how the steps. And so a big part of what we do is that we do an audit, which we'll explain later, that helps organizations see areas of growth and what it looks like to make progressions towards equity, inclusion, and diversity. Because even saying it seems so big, and it seems like sometimes you can just get lost in doing things that you don't know if it's actually working. And then fun. At the end of the day, like, these are topics that historically we in society have not done well, have not talked about. And so for us, we try to make it fun, interactive, and also relational, because we're humans, we want to interact, and there's stories behind how people come into these conversations. So that's like our approach, and you'll see hopefully that through this small time that we have together. And so the topic of today that we're going to do is we're going to talk about how can organizations assess their cultural competence when it comes to strengths and weaknesses. And so one of the first things to be aware of is that here's at Cultured Enough, we just truly have walked through this process and realized that when we're thinking about diversity, inclusion, and equity, especially I would say in the last 5 months, Elisa, we have talked with a lot of organizations, and in talking with them and walking alongside them, there is usually a disconnect and I think it was shared today in the main gathering at the beginning, is cultural competence is one's ability to interact and effectively with people outside of their own ethnic and culture and even gender group. And I say effectively just because to do that, you have to be aware of yourself, you have to be aware of other people. And we have seen, I would say in the last 5 months, on perfect stages in organizations, in media, not be culturally competent and emotionally aware, and a little bit of scared to address topics or not knowing how to address them. And so one of the things that we have assessed organizations with, and we just look at, is very simple for us, is to say, okay, is your organization even addressing and talking about uncomfortable topics? So if that's, should we have a stance on Black Lives Matter? Or should we talk about the Me Too movement? Or should we even address the disparities that maybe are happening in organizations, what we have seen, honestly, and it's a little bit sad, is that most organizations haven't taken time to say where we at ourselves. So it's easy to point to the outside, but where you at yourselves when it comes to your effectiveness and what that looks like. And so we've seen a lot of organizations with a low cultural competence not address it, sweep it underneath the rug, or use excuses like, hey, we don't have any Black people or minorities, so we don't have to talk about it. And what that has shown us is addressing a human issue about people being treated normal and have the dignity that everyone should have is not just a Black issue, it's a human issue. And we have also seen in some of our research that white people want to talk about this too. That it's not just minorities or Black people that want to talk about injustice and opportunities to talk about diversity and inclusion, but that white people want to talk about it and they care about what the organization does. So if you don't say anything, then you're actually saying something. You're actually talking and sharing with people that, hey, we don't do that here. And Elisa, you're going to talk about the posture of, as a leader, what you should have if maybe you feel uncomfortable. But I do want us to be aware of that the more we have worked with organizations, we have seen sort of an opening to really walk and say, okay, how do we get better at our cultural competency? How do we get better at being emotionally intelligent? And then talking about how can we assess that? Like, how do we actually know we can take some steps? And we're going to give you two ways you can sort of start to think about assessing your organization when you think about the cultural competence. And just one of those, I told you, is do you even have the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion? Do you talk about?
Can I add to that real quick, JL, before we go to the debates? Thank you. Even before that, I'm sure that there's maybe leaders or CEOs on here that are probably thinking, let's be honest, because this is what the responses we've gotten in the last couple of months as well, is like, you know, why are we even bringing in this into the workplace? You know, why can't we just do work? Why can't you clock in, clock out, and let that be that? And that has been a question that we've had to address in terms of why are we bringing these issues up in work now? And if you could even speak to the notion and the change of now how your workplace really needs to emphasize of a psychologically safe work environment so that your employees feel like they can engage, they feel like they can disagree and not be penalized for it. They can be creative and innovative. So when you want those aspects within your employees, you need to be able to have a human side to manage people within your tech industry, within your tech company. No matter how much you want people to clock in, clock out, they're always going to come in with things that they're carrying, with emotional and cultural just nuances that are beneficial for you as a leader to know and to be aware of. So I just wanted to put that out there because people are now wondering, you know, why do we have to even have these conversations at work? Why can't we just talk about, you know, golf or sports or the football game? But that too also needs to come into context with now you're like working with humans, and to be able to do that, to be able to understand them so that they can be a successful, just a partner in your work environment. So I just wanted to address that real quick before we get into the tools.
Well, and a fun study, because I think I know the tech industry, like specific industries that have struggled when it comes to minorities in the industry or minorities in leadership. So that's women and people of color. There is a study that Google did years back about psychological safety, and said like for tech industry, especially when you think about making decisions, that there has to be a sense of I can take risks, I can ask questions, people around me understand me. And for diversity, because you're starting to bring different people into the group, it's helpful when you have different cultural groups that maybe want people to ask them questions or want to talk and know them a little bit better just outside, not just in doing projects. And so that's something that we have seen organizations, especially in tech industries and in the medical, that historically haven't been that relational, take that shift to say, hey, let's be more relational. Let's create environments where we're having healthy dialogue and conversation so that we can know each other, because it's important when it comes to innovation. It's important when it comes to psychological safety and even the happiness of an employee, so that you can retain them and keep them. So Lisa, what can they do? Give them sort of like if they're thinking like, hey, I want to assess more about cultural competency. What can I do as a leader or in my organization?
Yeah. So with any, and I'm sure if you're a strategic thinking person, whenever you try to attack a problem, gaps are. You need to know where the areas of improvement are that you want to capitalize on. And we do that through tools such as surveys, focus groups. This is the route that Cultured Enough takes, but it's also a route that maybe a diversity chief officer would take within their own organization as well. So we do ask that if you're the one to want to take these tools and utilize them within your workplace to get a pulse and to get a climate of where your organization is, we just ask that you be aware of your organization's culture. We ask that you be aware of where you're at in terms of your cultural competency as well as your organization's cultural competency. Because JL, haven't we seen it done where organizations do try to do the inside work themselves, and usually there's no follow through, or you have excited employees that are ready to like do the focus groups, do the surveys, and see the results of that. But sometimes when an organization is doing it themselves, it's kind of hard to have that outside perspective of what's going on. Where have you seen that?
And that has happened a lot. I mean, it takes, once again, it takes a healthy leader, emotionally and culturally, to be willing to say, hey, here are areas we need to grow in, and I'm going to be very transparent to share them. However, that does create a culture where people can trust. And so we've seen organizations that we've stepped into, they literally say this, hey, we've done focus groups, we've done surveys, and staff are like, this is great, but I know nothing's going to come out of this. And here's what that shows us, because we like assessing, we have an indicator that shows us that the organization's culture does not have healthy boundaries / is not transparent, and there's a lack of trust. And you need trust. I mean, like with anything, you need trust if you're going to take risks, if you're going to talk about implicit bias, if you're going to talk about microaggressions, if you're going to talk about equity and inclusion, you need to trust the people around you that are going to care for you, but also walk alongside you in the learning process. And most organizations that we've worked with, in some ways, staff, especially minorities, just don't trust them. And so we had to sort of do a lot of the say, if we're going to do this, focus groups, share results, you have to be very transparent and share these results to the staff and also the people in the organization, so that they know that you've heard them. And that's a big part, is like the hearing process, so that they know they're not alone.
Yeah. And so personally, when you're a leader of maybe your department or a work group that you're in, or maybe you're the CEO of a senior leadership team, a way to personally assess competence within even dynamics among people is look out for body language. I don't know, but a microaggression can be nonverbal. So if you're not making eye contact, if you're brushing someone off, that is defined as a microaggression to someone. Look at power dynamics. Who's powering the conversation, who's interrupting who never speaks. Look out for that person that never speaks in the meeting, and kind of call on them to be able to hear their voice. So there's ways in which you can become emotionally and culturally competent to be able to read room and read your group, so that you can see the power dynamics of what's going on in your organization.
Yeah, well, Lisa, speak more into that, because you're dropping some knowledge, and I know we're running through like this is normal thing. Process more of this, of like, talk about power dynamics even when you're assessing an organization. Why is that important? Even maybe when you're thinking about, hey, we want to do some focus groups, we want to do some surveys. How can leaders be aware of just power dynamics?
Yeah, power dynamics is huge, and it's something that, again, is nonverbal, but you need to be aware of it in terms of, for example, when we do our strategic focus groups and Cultured Enough, we make sure that there are no supervisors or managers within those focus groups of any direct reports, simply because, if I want to speak my mind on the organization or my department, I'm only going to say so much with the person that's paying me on the call. So it kind of filters that out for me. And I'm limited to what I share. So when we want to get a 100% truthful perception of someone's experience and knowledge within the organization, we try to separate managers from those that are their direct reports, because power dynamics is a real thing. For example, when we have the HR presence and the HR is actually the CFO of the company, I'm not going to go to the CFO of the company if I have a problem, because they're writing my checks. So it's like, knowing about power dynamics is huge.
Yeah. And being, because I know these are a lot of startups. So once again, we work with small and medium, even large. We
Mhm.
worked with companies that say, hey, we don't have an HR. How do we create these types of environments where people are trusting us? And a part of that is saying, okay, if you don't have an HR and maybe it's a CEO, the CFO who does a lot of the reporting or his reporting, there has to be a clearness of expectations. And
Yeah.
it's small, but expectation of here's what harassment looks like, here's what a bias looks like. And we're going to make sure that we have a line of communication that's
Mhm.
confidential when these things happen so we can address them. So there are ways where you don't need a chief HR person to create psychological safety. You need
Right.
to articulate, you need to have clear definitions,
Mhm.
you need to always keep reminding people that it's going to be easy for us to be an organization that drifts towards the people who act and look like us, because that's just a part of biases in ourselves, is that we want to be and hang out with people who think
Mhm.
like us and act like us. So I think there are ways that small businesses, especially if you're small in the tech industry, can think about how to create psychological safety and how to create limit power dynamics
Yeah.
that typically come when you're in a smaller organization.
I love it.
Yeah. Amy, like I said, any questions? If you have questions, please put them in the chat. We would love to address the questions that you have specifically, maybe even for your organization, or things that you want us to clarify uh, into that. A disclaimer, I want to say, if you're a leader or you're an organization and you say, hey, we want to do some of this stuff internally, know if there has been a lot of cultural trauma or lack of support towards staff around these topics,
Mhm.
because that will affect if staff actually share and be honest with you. The goal is that you want honesty and transparency. And if you feel like you can't receive that, then we would strongly suggest outsourcing it, so that at least staff will be honest with someone that they don't know and they don't see every day, and there's not going to be a sense of I can be bullied, or this can be repercussions if I'm honest.
Mhm.
So know that, and that's hard for leaders to sometimes evaluate our own culture and our organization. But we have seen a lot of successful organizations do that because they just felt, say, hey, we're going to outsource this because it's important and we want to see some growth in that. So just be aware of your organization's culture, and also your culture and your emotional intelligence to say, are you equipped to do that type of work if you're going to do it in-house?
Real good.
Yep. And then one of the things, at least, I mean, you can sort of speak into a lot, is this concept of defining terms for teams and organizations.
Yes, definitely. Just really quickly, because I really want to get into what we can and can't control, JL.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
diversity is really looking at the numbers of people within your organization to be able to get a pulse. That's something you can kind of, do your demographics and measure that. Inclusion is looking at the culture within the organization. How much of a culture of inclusion do you truly have? And Cultured Enough can help you measure that, can put metrics and indicators to measure that for you. And equity is really looking at the processes. How much is it advancement available to everyone within your organization? Are they aware of advancement opportunities, career opportunities within your organization? And is it at an equitable opportunity for them? So is the CEO, the supervisor meeting with other people more than others? Are they meeting only with people that are similar to their culture? Are they playing golf when no one else is invited to golf? So like look at those nuances of equity within your organization is key.
I'll give you a good example. I want to give a good example too. Like when we think of even small things like happy hour at night, where we say, hey, everyone go out. And then we start to say, okay, most of the time we've seen if you're a woman, it might be hard to go out if you have children. But if you're going out at the bar, hanging out, and that's where you're talking about new opportunities, new projects, then you're creating a space where it's not equitable. So what we like to say is like a picture. When you see a picture of a team, you can look and just say the picture looks diverse. Now the question you can't see in the picture is inclusion. Do they actually get along? Rarely in pictures do you see someone like frustrated or like, I don't want to be here. We have seen pictures like that in organizations, but the inclusion is harder to actually like get a pulse of. But that's like, at least briefly, like, are people interacting? Do they feel like at the end of the day, that they have the same opportunities. And then the equity aspect is when you start to look at pay, how much they're meeting, who's interacting with who, is it fair across the board? And that's something that we put a big emphasis on for managers, is that sometimes when you're a manager, it is a challenging job, but we have to make sure that every staff is being evaluated the same. It's clear expectations regarding, hey, when's the evaluation period? Here's how promotions look out loud. When jobs are going to be offered, here's how the expectations for this job that's going to be offered, instead of just assuming that people know. And that's typically where we find people are not aware of, like, how to create healthy, equitable structures and processes, is communicating so that everyone's on the same page and making sure that you're actually talking about this in environments where everyone is there, not just half the people are there. And that's what happened when you're at a bar hanging out with some friends.
Yep. That's good.
So the question why, defining the why for this. So
can I
why is it important?
On this real quick?
Yeah, please go first. It's like hopscotch.
You
can go first and I'll hop in after.
Right. The crazy thing, defining the why, like, why are we doing diversity inclusion efforts? Why are we progressing our company? The crazy thing, and if we want to be real, is that a lot of people have been pressured this summer with current events going on, and from social media and from society and their employees. There's been pressure on leaders overall. And so I want leaders to really ask themselves, why are they doing this? Are they doing it to appease their employees, to kind of maybe do a check, just check the box to say, oh yeah, during the focus groups are doing this, and then we can carry on in life? Or is there truly, like, I have a vision for my organization. We are all white leadership right now. We're in a diverse city. How can we change, and how can we reflect the city we work in or the clients that we serve? So it's crazy, Jaya, when we see different CEOs that come to us, and we're really trying to figure out what the motive is as well. And a lot of white CEOs are really trying to navigate this space for the first time, and they're also trying to figure out their why as well. So I just wanted to add that it's important to know motive as well.
Yeah, and this is good. This is good because I do think the vulnerability step into this conversation is essential for success. Because here's why I think that's, if you're addressing this topic in the last 4 to 5 months, stepping into it, being vulnerable and saying, you know what, we know we should have addressed this before, and even going into this, I'm uncomfortable, but I know this needs to happen, creates such an opportunity for people as a leader to see you come in that posture. What we've seen everyone in society, what we've seen in society is almost this thing of, like, leaders who don't want to address it, they don't say anything. And then they get backlash from employees and companies. Or you have leaders who say, hey, we're going to do something, but they don't really say what they're going to do. And they don't honestly take a sense of, like, hey, we don't know what we're doing, but we know there's a problem, and we want to focus in our organization. And I say that is because there are out things, and you're going to talk about things we can't control and can't control. But in this conversation, I do think it takes a very emotionally and culturally intelligent leader to get in front of a group of people and say, I have not led us the right way when it comes to these topics around diversity, equity, and inclusion. That stops now.
Yep.
We as an organization, here's why we're committed to this. And your why is essential. Your why cannot be because it's a good thing to do for the market, or because, like, to be honest, and I'm going to take off this as a person of color, as a Black individual, I don't speak for everyone. However, these are some common things. I want to know if you're human. Is this a human thing that ideally you would want to address as an organization? Because that is important, besides, oh, we're doing this because we want to be the best in our marketplace, or we're doing this because everyone else is doing this. And so I do think there's this sense of, as leaders, spending time by yourself and fleshing out, why are you doing this? And then can you articulate this to other people? As a consultant, sometimes people come to us and they think it's our job to articulate the why for them. Our job is to help you find your why, but you need to communicate that to your leaders and your team of why this is important and why the organization keep moving towards equity and inclusion and diversity.
So we get this.
So let's get to the
You want to go?
Go ahead. Let's get to that one.
Because
The things we can and can't control,
because when you can, looking at it from like a CEO perspective and wanting to create change within your organization, we always tell this to our partners: is focus on what you can control versus what you can't control. So even when we work with national corporations who have a national board or national CEO, that it's really hard to move structure on that level. We talk to whoever's on the regional level, whoever's on the local level. What can you control? And we ask them to look specifically at their culture, their policies, and their processes. And even with our assessment, we help measure and the climate of where our clients at. So JL, do you want to talk to one of the three?
Yeah, I want to say once again with like even just simple policies. So I know we all try to stay up to date on policies that are happening and what that looks like in our document. But one of the things that we have found is a lot of organizations have policies, but what's happening is they're not being what we call processed. They're not being communicated with all, hear my language, all the employees correctly. Typically what we have seen is that there are policies that they have, and then we ask employees or staff, hey, are you aware of this policy? Are you aware of vacation time? Or even are you aware of how to report when harassment happens or someone says a negative racial slur? And literally their first response is, no, I don't know how to do that. And I wouldn't feel comfortable even sharing or asking that question out loud. And so the goal is that when you're thinking about assessing your organization's cultural competence, is that you're trying to say, okay, what you can't control. We can all control how we articulate expectations and what that looks like continually. And that's just not the time you hire someone. Typically people say, oh, I think I learned about that when I got hired. And that's one thing you say, okay, that has to be a part of the DNA, because cultural competency can't just be an add-on. Diversity can't just be like, we'll do it now because of the incidents and the pressure. It has to be a part of the culture. It has to be a part of and that might be new, that takes time. But the more you work at something, the more you get better at it, the more effective you are. And so that's one of the things that I just want to highlight, is that we can control a lot of the processes, which is what we're communicating and how we're making sure that it gets shared with other people the correct way.
Yeah, it's when we're with our partners, and one of our focus group questions is we really ask them about, how can you ensure that everyone's treated equally? What policies are in place to ensure? And so far from what I've seen is that there's silence, because they really have to think about how are they protected as an employee? Who can they go to when they have questions that won't put them at risk at all for demotion or even with their reputation within the workplace. So it's just so important for, as a leader or a CEO, not only say point people to the handbook, but how are you communicating those policies and processes in a way where your employees feel empowered and feel safe, that they can be themselves, that they can produce well, that they can be innovative, and they can engage without feeling penalized for anything else. So it's just so important to not only have a handbook written, because a lot of people like to point people to a handbook. Is it being articulated well, and is it being communicated throughout the organization?
Yeah, I will give some small tips out there. If you're like, hey, where can we start? I think if you're a smaller organization, the question is, hey, you might not want to start with a diversity complete audit, but some good things to start is like, hey, maybe we just want to first do a climate survey to ask some specific questions about, like, do we have a culture and a climate that allows employees to feel great? One of the good things when you start to do, hopefully you work with if you do outsourcing, is that they can break that data up by race and gender and age, which gives you some disaggregated data. But a small thing just to take and start is just saying, hey, maybe we could do a climate survey 2 times a year, which allows us to see, are we growing more when it comes to people taking risks or asking questions or addressing topics, especially around, I would say, especially in the last 5 months, we have just seen so many organizations want to have a conversation around diversity or want to talk about the injustices, but haven't done the work before. And there's this like tension that I'm like, I don't expect people to have a healthy conversation. And Harvard Business Review did a study about how some of these panels that are happening, especially when you're bringing Black people in, creates cultural trauma. It brings triggers, and then it doesn't have a healthy environment to actually learn and have dialogue. If anything, it creates guilt. It creates a trigger for people of color. So just be aware of when you're thinking about working through these things as your organization, the size is that you've done a lot of work to like evaluate, to say, here's where we're at. And if we want to go and to actually start to ask these questions and grow our cultural competency, do we have people in-house that can do some of that, or do we need some help outside? And there's just some great resources, like Harvard Business Review has great resources. Implicit bias test is great too. It's free, that you can use, and just making sure that this is staying in front of the conversation in your organization.
Thanks, JL. We really want to also hear from you also. I don't know if there's a Q&A chat box or things of that nature, if we can hear from you. We do have a PDF document that is a tool to be able to empower your leadership as well, just in terms of doing that. JL, do you want to hit a couple points on this?
Yeah, so this is just a tool that we sort of say, okay, if you want to dive into these conversations, be more culturally competent, here are 3 things you can do to help create this type of environment. And so I know that April, we're going to send this over, and April is going to share this. But this is give you some tangible steps. Once again, our approach is very tangible. We want to make sure that if you're going to start it or where you're at, you can make the next step to say, how do we get competency? How do we grow more into this? And that's why we always like to give like tools away, just because we want work environments to be better than where they're at currently, and keep going towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we have actually 13 minutes, which means that we can answer some great questions from the group.
I haven't seen a Q&A chat thing. I don't know if this allows that.
Yeah, it has it on the right side. They can access it in the session. On the session, the right side, it says events/sessions, and it talks about chats.
Right, I'm coming on board to say that you should be able to see it on the right side of your screen, and there are a few people participating. Patrick McNeil asks, how essential do we think having a designated HR person in the office is?
Oh.
And then asking for a friend who works in a very small office.
Yeah. Thanks, Patrick. Elisa, I'm gonna let you go first, and I'm gonna do the cleanup, because this is a good question, and I do believe there's a certain ways to answer it the effective way, but I'll let you go first, and then I'll respond.
How essential do we think having a designated HR person in the office is? Very essential, just in the fact that it's going back to psychological safety in the workplace. We just finished a focus group with one of our partners yesterday, and it was a focus group of all women. And they were very real conversations of being a mother in the workplace and having to deal with maternity leave, what happens when you come back from maternity leave, how you're treated in the workplace. So that came up as a problem. And just I'm using that as a real anecdotal example of how the women in the organization did not feel safe because HR was tied to the CFO, which was a white male. And so when you are having, when you're not having a place to go to talk about your pay, talk about how you're being treated by your supervisor, without it being tied to anyone, again, going back to power dynamics, right? So without going back to a CFO or someone in a different department that has access to your even your advancement within the organization, you want to create an environment of psychological safety as much as possible. And for the most part, usually having a designated HR person will allow your employees and staff to have one place to go to where they can ask the questions and where they can advocate for themselves without risking any demotion or any pay increases or anything of that nature. So, JL, that's kind of my answer from like a policy process standpoint. But what would you have to add to that?
I want to add, if I know some businesses can't afford an HR and they outsource, and once again, outsourcing HR, they do, because we know they do what they do, which is to make sure you barely, so they do the policy. Once again, HR does a good policy if you outsource. They do not really do an effective training and development on the processes and then on the climate, which if you have an HR person, that should be their focus is policy, processes, and climate. And so I do want us to be aware that some people can't afford it. So organizations, I'm all right. But that means you intentionally have to do things to make sure that processes are being followed through well, and then doing surveys constantly to make sure that the climate is allowing staff to feel like it's safe. And that usually is what happens when you outsource something, is you don't have that. And then when you insource it, it really allows you to say, now we can get this information directly to us and we have someone that we can point to. And that's just essential. The more you start to have minorities, and just as an organization, is it's easy to say I can walk to someone and talk to them compared to I have to call someone who's not in my organization that I really don't know, and they have other companies. And so that's just something to be aware of. The larger you go, especially if you feel like you can't communicate the things that are happening and going on in your work environment to your direct supervisor or the CEO. Great question, Patrick.
If anyone doesn't have questions, Jay, I'm wondering if we can go through kind of what Cultured Enough offers and how they can follow up with us afterwards.
Yeah, let's do that. I'll wait for like a few seconds because I know maybe people are just processing still. And I'll go into what we do, but I still want to see if people have specific questions that they've seen other companies do, or questions that they would just are intrigued to hear about when it comes to cultural intelligence in their work environment. Well, that's enough time right there.
That's enough time.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into it. Oh, how do you?
Oh, that's great.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, how do you track efforts at cultural competency? So there are a few ways to track it. First thing, you want to track what's being provided. So typically what we do, most organizations do this. It's not effective, but they'll do a training. So they'll do an implicit bias training for an hour, and then they won't do any more training. But what's helpful when it comes to research is that you actually want to have specific questions before they step into an implicit bias training. And then you want to provide the training for them. And then you want to also provide maybe a few more trainings throughout the year with a survey on the same questions to see, are they growing in their implicit bias or their cultural competency? And it's sad, and we explained in our next workshop, most organizations assume trainings will fix everything, but trainings help. But if you don't track what people are progressing, what they're learning, and how they're doing, it doesn't work well. So their Cultural Intelligence Center is a great place that literally tracks cultural competency or cultural IQ for a person. However, it doesn't tell you what you need to do as a whole, but I like to use that. I like to use an individual cultural development plan, which we've developed an actual document to help track the progression of cultural intelligence per staff. And especially if you're a small organization, I think you can create some documents and help staff grow in their cultural competency, and just do surveys, which we talk about quarterly or just annually, to see progression in specific topics that you want. If that's healthy cross-cultural interactions with staff in the work environment, if that's power and gender dynamics, if that's dismantling implicit bias, those are things you actually can track through surveys, and then provide trainings to help people learn more about it.
To that really quickly, JL, a simple efforts at cultural competency is educating oneself. So that is reading articles, that is reading books of different cultures that are different from yourself. How do you get into their world? How do you figure out how they think and how they process? not really assuming that everyone processes like you and everyone thinks like you, is someone that has cultural competence because they're educated in that way. And there's so many resources out there, and Cultured Enough would love to help you provide those resources as well in terms of articles and readings that have to do with cultures that are outside of your own. JL, another great question.
Yeah.
DEI is separate role from HR. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't laugh because it's research shows if it's done the effective way, yes, it is. And here's why. Equity, inclusion, and diversity, ideally, if it's a part of the culture, it ties into everything. And sometimes we just assume HR is one, but we're talking about professional development. We're talking about the workforce, the workplace, the marketplace, all those things intertwine. And sometimes what we've seen, and a part of that's because some HR individuals just haven't had diversity, inclusion, and equity training. And that causes them sometimes to get clumped. And what happens is that now you have DI in the HR office and it just focuses on like HR policy. But really the goal is that if you have a DEI person, they should be in senior leadership, just like the HR and then the CEO and the CFO, because you're all thinking about this. And the DEI person actually just helping, putting this on the forefront and making sure this doesn't get lost into the conversation.
Great, that's good. I want to hit on this last question too. Any tips for helping teams to keep in mind what they have learned during implicit bias training all year? After the initial training is complete, are there good recommended touch points teams can implement aside from asynchronous surveys? That's a really good question. Wow.
Yeah. I think that's beautiful. Having groups, as in, so what we do typically, and people say, okay, we've done trainings all year and we do surveys. We say, okay, let's have actual tangible groups throughout the year to talk about how you're dismantling one's implicit bias. And that's intentionality, that's creating groups to say, let's talk about them out loud. Because if we're honest, implicit bias is a everyday interaction we have in the work environment. The tough part is that we assume that they're just trainings. We don't sort of incorporate them and say, hey, are there biases happening just in our daily interactions that we want to address as a team? And so what we like to talk about is creating groups outside of if we do a training in departments to have more conversations about what are personal implicit biases we're seeing or going through, we're seeing in the organization too, that we should address. But that's a great question. Who asked that question?
It is a great question. To add to that, Suzanne,
that was a great question.
Culture is everything. So like even when you're when you have the implicit bias training going on for a year, really knowing that there is you're creating a culture of having people comfortable talking about implicit bias. So implicit bias is also having people check themselves when they're doing an interview, for example. When we do it, when we walk people through interview process and the onboarding process, we ask that you have more than one person in the room because that's a culture of accountability.
I'm the only one here.
No, you're not. I'm here.
Lisa might not be here, but
no, I'm here.
Any other questions, Suzanne? That was a great question. I like it. I'm curious then what you've been learning doing the implicit bias training for a year.
JL, can you hear me? JL.
And then I can't hear you, but let's see.
Okay.
I think we're back. Can anyone hear me? Can you hear us now or no?
Yeah, we can hear you, JL. Can you hear me though? I don't think you can hear me. Keep going, Elisa. That's hilarious. I love the encouragement. I'm gonna keep going, JL. To Susan's point, really quickly, just want to say, if there's implicit bias training going on once, the culture, it begins to change the culture and how you do all the other processes within the organization. So Suzanne,
Okay.
great.
So
What
I
you
know
don't wanna
the time.
do-
Thanks for
oh my
joining
God.
us. Once again, we have another one coming up, but we'll send the tool out that you have it. And once again, Coach Enough is a diversity consultant firm. We exist to help small and medium-sized businesses who can't afford a chief diversity officer at an affordable price. We're excited, especially with what's happening through this sort of season, how organizations are thinking different and doing different things to address topics like injustice, Black Lives Matter. What does it look like to be an organization that thinks about culture, intelligence, and diversity, equity, and inclusion? And so y'all are already doing some of the great work. And so keep doing what you're doing, because we need good companies that love people, but also create an environment where all staff feel valued and cared for and supported. And so thank y'all so much for being with us, allowing us to sort of chop it up, and hopefully look forward to partnering in the future.